In 1933, 5 men vanished without a trace. Only a pair of shoes remained, worn, abandoned, and belonging to the eldest son. What happened next would turn their disappearance into a chilling mystery no one could explain. Detective Marcus Thorne hadn't expected to find anything more than dust and regret. When he finally cleaned out his late father's attic in the old Victorian house on Maple Street, his father, a retired police sergeant, had been a pack rat of the highest order, keeping boxes of case files, newspaper clippings, and photographs that spanned 4 decades of law enforcement. Marcus had been putting off this task for months since the funeral, but the estate lawyer's deadline was looming, and the house needed to be sold. As he worked through the 3rd box of yellow documents, his fingers brushed against something wedged behind a loose board in the attic wall. It was a manila envelope, unmarked and brittle with age, containing a single black-and-white photograph that made his blood run cold. The photograph showed 5 men standing in front of what appeared to be an old mill or factory building. They were dressed in the style of the 1930s, with suspenders, work shirts, and flat caps. But it wasn't their clothing that caught Marcus's attention. It was their faces. Each man bore a striking resemblance to the others, clearly members of the same family, ranging in age from what appeared to be a teenager to a man in his 50s. What made the image truly unsettling was the date stamped on the back. October 15th, 1933. Along with a handwritten note in his father's familiar scrawl. Malford family. All 5 disappeared same day. Only Edmund's shoes found at Widow's Creek, still warm. Case never solved. Marcus stared at the photograph for several minutes, his detective's instincts prickling. Something about the men's expressions seemed forced, as if they were trying to smile, despite some underlying tension or fear. He had never heard his father mention the Malford case, which was strange, considering how often the old man had regaled him with stories from his early days on the force. Marcus flipped the photograph over again, studying every detail. The building in the background had distinctive architectural features, arched windows, and a peculiar bell tower that he thought he might recognize. The more he looked at it, the more convinced he became that the structure was the old Brennan Mill, which had been abandoned for decades, but still stood on the outskirts of Millbrook, the small town where his father had begun his career. The mill had been closed since the late 1930s, supposedly due to economic pressures from the Great Depression. But Marcus had always heard whispers about strange accidents and unexplained incidents that had plagued the facility. As evening shadows began to creep across the attic floor, Marcus felt an overwhelming compulsion to learn more about this forgotten case. He carefully placed the photograph in a protective sleeve and gathered what few other documents seemed related to the 1930s period. His father's old case notes were meticulous, but there was a conspicuous gap in the files between October and December of 1933, almost as if several weeks' worth of records had been deliberately removed. The silence surrounding the Malford family's disappearance began to feel less like an oversight and more like a cover-up. Marcus had always prided himself on his ability to solve cold cases, and this one seemed to be calling out to him from across the decades. The photograph seemed to pulse with secrets in his hands, and Marcus realized that his weekend plans had just changed dramatically. He would drive to Millbrook first thing in the morning and begin investigating what had happened to the Malford family. Something told him that this wasn't just a simple missing persons case that had gone cold due to lack of evidence or resources. The fact that only Edmund's shoes, still warm, had been found suggested something far more sinister and immediate than a planned disappearance. As he carefully locked the photograph in his briefcase, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to uncover something that powerful people had worked very hard to keep buried. The dusty attic suddenly felt oppressive, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting to see what secrets would finally come to light. Some mysteries are meant to stay buried, but this one won't let me sleep until I know the truth. Marcus arrived in Millbrook just after dawn, the photograph burning a hole in his jacket pocket as he drove through the sleepy town's main street. The place had the worn, forgotten quality of so many small industrial towns that had been left behind by progress. Empty storefronts with faded signs, a few elderly residents moving slowly along cracked sidewalks, and an overwhelming sense that better days were long in the past. His first stop was the Millbrook Historical Society, housed in a converted Victorian mansion that doubled as the town's unofficial gossip central. The elderly librarian, Mrs. Coopersmith, proved to be a treasure trove of local knowledge, though her eyes grew wary when Marcus mentioned the Malford family name. She confirmed that the 5 men, Harold Malford and his 4 sons, Edmund, Franklin, George, and Henry, had indeed vanished on October 15, 1933, but her account differed from the sparse details in his father's notes. According to Mrs. Coopersmith, the family had been involved in some kind of labor dispute at the Brennan Mill, where all 5 men worked in various capacities. Harold had been a floor supervisor, while his sons worked the machinery and handled transportation of goods. The mill owner, Cornelius Brennan, had reportedly been facing financial difficulties and was considering layoffs when the family disappeared. What made the case even stranger was that several other mill workers had also vanished around the same time, though their disappearances had been spread out over several weeks and hadn't initially been connected. Mrs. Coopersmith led Marcus to a filing cabinet filled with old newspaper clippings, her arthritic hands trembling slightly as she pulled out a folder marked 1933, The Troubles. The headlines painted a picture of a town in crisis: mill workers missing, strange accidents plague Brennan facility, and police baffled by disappearances. One article particularly caught Marcus's attention. It mentioned that Edmund Malford, the eldest son at 28, had been asking questions about safety violations and worker conditions in the weeks before the family vanished. A former co-worker was quoted as saying Edmund had discovered something that made him white as a sheet, and that he'd been talking about going to the authorities in the county seat. The more Marcus read, the clearer it became that the Brennan Mill had been the epicenter of whatever had happened to the Malford family. Mrs. Coopersmith reluctantly provided directions to the abandoned facility, though she warned him that locals avoided the area due to its reputation for accidents and strange occurrences. According to her, 3 separate attempts to demolish the building over the decades had resulted in serious injuries to the work crews, and eventually the town had simply decided to let it stand and rot. She also mentioned that Cornelius Brennan had died just 6 months after the disappearances, found dead in his office from an apparent heart attack, though some claimed he'd been acting paranoid and erratic in his final weeks. As Marcus prepared to leave the Historical Society, Mrs. Coopersmith grabbed his arm with surprising strength. Her voice dropped to a whisper as she told him about her own father, who had worked at the mill during those final months in 1933. According to her father's deathbed confession years later, Brennan had been involved in some kind of illegal operation, both using the mill as a front, and workers who asked too many questions had a way of disappearing. Her father had quit just days before the Malford family vanished, claiming he'd seen things that weren't natural in the mill's basement levels, Mrs. Coopersmith had never spoken about this before, but something about Marcus's earnest determination had convinced her to share her family's long-held secret. Armed with this new information, Marcus drove toward the outskirts of town, following a rutted dirt road that led through increasingly dense woods toward the Brennan Mill. The autumn air was crisp and filled with the scent of decaying leaves, but as he got closer to his destination, an unnatural chill seemed to settle over the landscape. The mill loomed ahead through the trees, its red brick facade stained with decades of weather and neglect, the distinctive bell tower visible, just as it had been in the photograph. But what struck Marcus most forcefully was the complete silence surrounding the building. No bird songs, no rustle of small animals, nothing but the sound of his own footsteps on the gravel as he parked his car and approached the structure. The mill stood waiting like a guilty secret, and I was about to become its confessor. The mill's main entrance was secured with a rusty chain and padlock that looked like it hadn't been disturbed in years, but Marcus found a side door where the wood had rotted enough to allow entry. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of pale sunlight that struggled through grimy windows, illuminating a cavernous space filled with the skeletal remains of industrial machinery. The air was thick with the smell of rust, mildew, and something else, something organic and unpleasant that made Marcus breathe through his mouth. He pulled out his flashlight and began a systematic exploration of the main floor, looking for anything that might connect to the photograph or the Malford family's disappearance. It was in a small office area near the back of the mill that Marcus found the first real clue. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard was a metal box containing what appeared to be payroll records from 1933, along with several documents that made his blood run cold. The papers detailed a scheme involving the use of mill workers as unpaid labor for a bootlegging operation that Cornelius Brennan was running in partnership with organized crime figures from the city. Workers who discovered the illegal activities were given a choice: participate and share in the profits, or face consequences that the documents euphemistically referred to as permanent reassignment. The Malford family, it seemed, had chosen a third option. They had planned to expose the entire operation to federal authorities. Among the papers was a letter in Edmund Malford's handwriting, addressed to a federal agent in the state capital. The letter detailed the bootlegging operation, mentioned several specific dates and shipments, and included a hand-drawn map of the mill's basement levels, where illegal liquor was being stored and distributed. Most chilling of all, the letter was dated October 14th, 1933. Just one day before the family disappeared, Edmund had planned to mail the letter the following morning, but he and his family had vanished before it could be sent. Marcus realized he was holding evidence of a murder plot that had been successfully carried out more than 90 years ago. But the documents raised as many questions as they answered. If the Malford family had been killed to prevent them from exposing the bootlegging operation, where were their bodies? And why had Edmund's shoes been found still warm at Widow's Creek, miles away from the mill? Marcus decided to explore the basement levels mentioned in Edmund's letter, despite the increasingly oppressive atmosphere that seemed to press down on him with each step deeper into the building. The basement stairs were treacherous with rot and debris, but his flashlight beam eventually revealed a subterranean chamber that had clearly been used for storage and distribution of illegal goods. It was there, in the deepest part of the basement, that Marcus made the discovery that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Behind a false wall that had partially collapsed over the decades, he found a small chamber containing 5 sets of human remains, still partially clothed in the work clothes visible in the photograph. But what made the scene truly horrifying was the evidence that the men had been walled up alive. Scratch marks on the interior walls, broken fingernails, and the positioning of the skeletons all suggested a desperate attempt to escape. A water-stained notebook near Harold Malford's remains contained entries that chronicled their final days, revealing that they had been imprisoned in the chamber for nearly a week before succumbing to dehydration and suffocation. The notebook entries painted a picture of psychological torture as well as physical imprisonment. Cornelius Brennan had apparently visited them daily, offering freedom in exchange for their silence and cooperation with his criminal enterprise. When they refused, he would leave them in darkness for hours at a time, occasionally bringing just enough food and water to keep them alive while he tried to break their resolve. The final entry, written in increasingly shaky handwriting, was Harold Malford's prayer for his sons, and his regret that their principles had doomed them all. Marcus sat in the darkness of that underground tomb, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the injustice that had been hidden for so many decades. I had found the Malford family at last, but their silence had been bought with a cruelty that defied. As Marcus sat among the remains of the Malford family, pieces of the puzzle began falling into place with sickening clarity. The shoes found at Widow's Creek hadn't belonged to Edmund Malford at all. They had been planted there by Brennan or his associates to create a false trail and misdirect the investigation. The warmth Mrs. Cooper-Smith's father had mentioned wasn't because Edmund had just removed them. It was because they had been deliberately heated to create the illusion of recent abandonment. This explained why the search efforts had focused on the creek area, while the real crime scene remained hidden beneath the mill. Marcus' examination of the chamber revealed additional evidence that painted a complete picture of Brennan's operation and the cover-up that followed. Hidden compartments in the walls contained correspondence between Brennan and corrupt officials, including Marcus's own father's immediate supervisor at the time, Captain Riley Morrison. The letters revealed that Morrison had been paid substantial sums to ensure that the investigation into the Malford disappearances would be superficial and quickly abandoned. Morrison had deliberately removed evidence from the case files and had assigned Marcus's father, then a rookie officer, to patrol duties far from the mill during the critical investigation period. The most damning document was a final letter from Brennan to Morrison, written just days before Brennan's own death. In it, Brennan expressed his growing paranoia and guilt over what they had done to the Malford family. He wrote about hearing voices in the mill at night and seeing figures that looked like the 5 men wandering the halls. The letter revealed that Brennan's heart attack hadn't been natural. He had taken his own life with an overdose of heart medication, unable to live with the knowledge of what he had orchestrated. Morrison had apparently covered up the suicide to protect himself and the other officials involved in the conspiracy. But perhaps the most shocking revelation came in the form of a small leather journal that Marcus found clutched in Harold Malford's skeletal hands. The journal contained not just the account of their imprisonment, but also detailed evidence of the extent of the corruption in the local government and law enforcement. Harold had been more than just a mill supervisor. He had been quietly documenting criminal activities throughout the region for months, planning to expose a network of corruption that reached far beyond the bootlegging operation. The Malford family hadn't just stumbled upon Brennan's crimes. They had been systematically gathering evidence to bring down an entire criminal enterprise. As Marcus carefully photographed each document and piece of evidence, he realized that his father had likely suspected the truth about Captain Morrison's involvement, but had never been able to prove it. The gap in his father's files from 1933 now made sense. His father had probably removed those documents himself to protect them from Morrison's influence, hiding them where they would eventually be found by someone who could act on them. The photograph in the attic hadn't been kept as a memento. It had been preserved as evidence, waiting for the right moment and the right person to uncover the truth. The weight of discovery pressed down on Marcus as he climbed back up from the basement chamber, his mind already working on how to handle this monumental revelation. He would need to involve the state police and federal authorities to ensure that local corruption couldn't interfere with the investigation again. The Malford family deserved justice, even if it came nearly a century late, and the truth about their courage and integrity needed to be told. As he emerged into the fading afternoon light, Marcus looked back at the mill and silently promised the 5 men whose remains lay beneath its floors that their sacrifice would finally have meaning. Justice delayed is justice denied, but some truths are powerful enough to resurrect the dead and condemn the living. Within 48 hours of Marcus's discovery, the abandoned Brennan Mill had transformed into a crime scene, bustling with state police investigators, forensic experts, and federal agents. Marcus had bypassed local authorities entirely, taking his evidence directly to the state attorney general's office, where the implications of corruption reaching back decades made it a priority case. The excavation of the basement chamber was conducted with painstaking care, treating it as both an active crime scene and a historical site of immense significance. Local media attention was intense but respectful, with reporters focusing on the heroism of the Malford family rather than sensationalizing their tragic end. The investigation quickly expanded beyond the original murders, as federal agents discovered that the corruption network Harold Malford had been documenting extended far into the present day. Several prominent local families had built their wealth on the foundation of criminal enterprises that began in the 1930s, using legitimate businesses to launder money from ongoing illegal activities. The evidence Harold had compiled, combined with modern investigative techniques, led to indictments that shocked the region and effectively dismantled criminal organizations that had operated with impunity for generations. Marcus found himself at the center of a media firestorm, as the story of the Malford family's courage and sacrifice captured national attention. The contrast between their integrity and the cowardice of those who had murdered them resonated with a public hungry for stories of genuine heroism. Documentary filmmakers, authors, and historians descended on Millbrook, transforming the sleepy town into an unlikely pilgrimage destination for those seeking to honor the memory of 5 men who had died rather than compromise their principles. The personal cost of the investigation began to weigh heavily on Marcus as he struggled with the knowledge of his father's unwitting role in the cover-up. Reading through his father's later case files, Marcus found subtle evidence that the older man had spent decades trying to atone for his failure to solve the Malford case, going above and beyond in other investigations, and showing particular dedication to cases involving missing persons. It became clear that his father had carried the guilt of that unsolved case throughout his entire career, never knowing how close he had come to the truth, or how his own supervisor had betrayed his trust. The revelation about Captain Morrison's corruption led to a broader examination of cold cases from the 1930s and 1940s, resulting in the reopening of 17 other investigations that had been deliberately sabotaged. 3 additional murder cases were solved, using evidence that Morrison had hidden or destroyed, bringing closure to families who had waited generations for answers. The ripple effects of Marcus's discovery continued to expand as historians and genealogists traced the connections between past crimes and present-day consequences, revealing how deeply corruption had shaped the region's development. As autumn turned to winter, Marcus attended the funeral service for the Malford family, a ceremony that drew hundreds of people from across the country who had been moved by their story. The 5 men were finally laid to rest in Millbrook Cemetery, their graves marked with a monument that celebrated their courage and integrity. Standing at the graveside, Marcus felt a profound sense of completion, knowing that he had fulfilled his father's unfinished mission and given voice to victims who had been silenced for far too long. In death, the Malford family had achieved the justice they died trying to secure, and their truth had proven stronger than decades of lies and cover-ups. 6 months after the discovery, Marcus stood in his father's old house, now his own, looking at a wall display he had created to honor both the Malford family and his father's dedication to justice. The original photograph was there, but it was now surrounded by documentation of the solved case, letters from grateful family members of other victims, and commendations from law enforcement agencies recognizing his work. The house had become a place of pilgrimage for other detectives working cold cases, and Marcus had established a foundation using his inheritance to provide resources for investigating historical crimes and corruption. The Brennan Mill had been transformed into a memorial and education center, with the basement chamber preserved exactly as Marcus had found it, serving as a powerful reminder of the consequences of unchecked corruption and the importance of individual courage in the face of overwhelming opposition. School groups visited regularly to learn about the Malford family's story, and many visitors left flowers and notes expressing their admiration for 5 men who had chosen death over dishonor. Marcus continued his detective work with a renewed sense of purpose, specializing in cold cases that involved potential corruption or cover-ups. His success with the Malford case had earned him a reputation as someone who couldn't be bought or intimidated, and he received requests for assistance from families and law enforcement agencies across the country. Each case he solved felt like another step in fulfilling the mission that Harold Malford had begun nearly a century earlier, holding the powerful accountable and giving voice to the voiceless. The photograph that had started it all remained on Marcus's desk as a daily reminder that justice, while sometimes delayed, was never truly impossible. He had learned that truth has its own momentum, gathering strength over time until it becomes impossible to ignore or suppress. The courage of 5 ordinary men had ultimately brought down a criminal network that had operated for generations, proving that integrity and determination could triumph even over death itself. In quiet moments, Marcus often reflected on the chain of events that had led him to that attic and that photograph. His father's decision to preserve the evidence, despite not being able to act on it at the time, had created a bridge across the decades that allowed justice to finally be served. The Malford family's sacrifice had not been in vain. Their story had inspired a new generation of investigators and activists to continue fighting corruption and seeking truth, no matter how deeply buried it might be. Some photographs capture a moment in time, but the best ones capture the eternal struggle between right and wrong, and remind us that the good fight is always worth fighting.